Hey there, everybody. Speech language pathologist Carrie Clark here. And on today's episode of the Speech and Language Kids podcast, I'm going to go a little bit off script and I'm going to give you guys a back to basics kind of a tutorial, a primer on how to do speech language therapy, whether you are at home or in the therapy space or in a classroom, how to help kids with communication challenges. So I'm going to take my, 6 years of schooling plus my 16 years of experience out in the field, and I'm going to distill all of that down to the most impactful pieces that you need to put in place to be able to help a child with communication challenges. So whether you are a speech language pathologist, an SLPA, a parent, a caregiver, a teacher, anyone who works with children with communication challenges, I'm going to give you the basics. We're going to go back to basics. What is the simplest, most streamlined way that you can help these kids? Okay? Now, like I said, I'm going off script here. I haven't scripted anything out for this one, so I'm just going to kind of talk you through the process, and I would love to take questions as I go along. So this is, as usual, I am live inside the hub. So hey, Hannah, Jeanette, and Emily, welcome. You guys can pop over into the chat and ask questions as I'm going along, and we can make this interactive. And if you are listening to this podcast and you would like to be a part of our live recordings, you can do that for free over at hub.speechandlanguagekids.com. And you will find that every week I go live and I record the podcast with participation from you guys. So, hey there, Maria, welcome. All right, so you guys ask questions as we go along, but I'm going to give you the big picture and a structured framework system that you can use to be able to help students or children with communication challenges. All right, so hey, Jasmine, welcome. Okay, let's start at the beginning, right? So what we usually find first is we have someone notices something's wrong. Sometimes it's very obvious what's wrong. Sometimes it's more of a gut feeling, especially from a parent who says, I don't think this is right. And that is really hard to go from that gut feeling to what's our plan. And so the piece that we start with then is what's traditionally called the evaluation. I like to call it a meet and greet in my system because I think that evaluation has a lot of connotation and baggage that comes with it that makes it kind of hard to feel happy and good about evaluations, but that's part of the process. So what I like to say, we start with a meet and greet, and we start by getting everyone who works with that child on the same page so that we can take us from gut feeling that something is wrong all the way to what's the therapy plan? What are we going to do to help this child? Okay, so the meet and greet then is looking at the different areas of communication and figuring out which ones the child is struggling with. And so this can look a lot of different ways, but I'm going to go over what the main areas are in terms of when we break down communication into specific skills. I'm going to tell you what the main areas are and what those might look like if a child is struggling in those areas. Because our first step is going to be to narrow it down to which areas of communication they're struggling with, okay? So our main areas that we're looking at are speech sounds, language, voice or resonance, fluency, functional communication, and social communication, okay? So let's go through each of these. Speech sounds is how they're actually saying the speech sounds, how they're pronouncing sounds. And so this is how easily can we understand their speech? How accurately are they saying each and every word and sound? Okay, so that's speech sounds. Language then is how children understand and use words, how they put those words together to make sentences. So all of those pieces like vocabulary and syntax and grammar and their ability to ask and answer questions and follow directions, all of those pieces are part of language. Now we also have voice and resonance, which is actually the vocal quality of their voice and whether or not they are too nasal or not nasal enough, and basically the quality of how the voice sounds. That goes into voice and resonance. Then we've got fluency, which is traditionally what we call stuttering. So this is kids that have repetitions or sound blocks or prolongations or cluttering, where they're speaking very quickly and dropping out sounds, lots of likes and ums and ahs, and having trouble finding the right word. Maybe we say the wrong word. Okay, so all of that goes into fluency. Then we have functional communication, which is our kids that are just struggling to get those first words, just being able to tell you what I need, to be able to get some words out to communicate basic wants and needs with others. And then social communication is all of those interaction pieces, being able to communicate with peers, being able to have a conversation and respond to others, and all of the skills that go into a back and forth interaction. Okay, so those are the 6 main areas of communication. So our first job in this process is going to just be to narrow it down to which of those areas they're struggling with. And we have a checklist for that inside the hub. It's on our main checklist page. It's the very first one you come to, and it is available with the free membership. So everybody can go over to hub.speechandlanguagekids.com, and you can look at that checklist and just check boxes for what seems to be going on with this particular child, and that will narrow it down to which areas. Most kids are going to have more than one area, so don't get startled by that. It's not always going to fall neatly into one box or another, but we can look at what the main areas are, and then from there, we can dig down to see, okay, which particular sub areas of those bigger areas are they struggling with, and how can we help them figure those skills out? How can we teach those skills? Okay. So at this point, I often have parents feel very overwhelmed. I think as speech language pathologists, maybe we've had enough training and all of this that it's not as overwhelming. And sometimes we can have an easier time picking where we want to go next. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we get overwhelmed too. And so I want to emphasize that it's really important that we look at narrowing down to what skill is going to help this child the most, and really focusing on one skill at a time, or maybe a couple, but not trying to hit everything at once, because it's not going to work. We're not going to be able to make good progress in a whole lot of different areas. And when you consider that these kids are also trying to make progress in their physical development, in their cognitive development, in their social emotional development, all of those things are all happening at the same time. And so if we can set our expectations for what we think will make the most difference for that child, then we can focus our energies and provide enough repetition that they're able to actually make progress. So that's what we want to see. We want to see them making progress. So I'm going to go through the different areas, and we're going to drill down a little bit more to the different ways you can support kids in these different areas. But I want you to be remembering that through this whole process, we are going to be prioritizing specific skills that we think will make the most difference. Okay? So let's start with the speech sound area. So this is the area where we're actually having trouble pronouncing specific sounds. Okay? So I've broken this out into 4 pathways. So what I'm calling a pathway is a larger plan that solves a specific problem. And so for speech sounds, our different pathways are kind of the different approaches to pronunciation therapy, basically. And so there's different ways that we can go about teaching them speech sounds that are going to be organized, but they're going to be different from each other. And so we can look and see which path is going to be most appropriate for each child. So you would, again, pick one of these. So if you said, okay, man, if we could just understand this child better, they would have such an easier time communicating, then we could start with speech sounds. And then here's the 4 pathways. So we have articulation, which is working one sound at a time. We have phonology, which is working on a group of sounds at a time. So this is saying, they're leaving off all the sound consonants at the ends of words. So we could work on that group of sound errors. Or they're taking all of their K's and G's and turning them into T's and D's. So we could use, that's called fronting. So we could do fronting. We could work on stopping of fricatives. So we're going to find specific patterns of errors that they're making and teach them the whole pattern. Okay, so that's the phonology way. Then we have one called the motor speech pathway. And this is for children who have motor speech problems with sounds. So it's not that they don't know how to say them. It's not that they're replacing all sounds with different sounds. It's that when they tell their brain, or their brain, I guess, tells their mouth to say the sound, there's a disconnect somewhere in there and it's not coming out right. So our kids with apraxia of speech, childhood apraxia, they have motor speech challenges. Our kids with dysarthria or CP, they have motor speech problems. And so this therapy approach is more about coordinating the muscles and getting the sounds to sequence together to make words. And so it's a slightly different approach. We start with very simple words that contain just one vowel and one consonant, and then we work our way up to longer words. Okay, so that's the motor speech pathway. And then the fourth pathway that I've identified is what I call the mumbling pathway. And that's because when I have a kid who needs this pathway, the parents and the teachers are telling me they're just mumbling, or they're mushing all their sounds together. They're slurring their speech. And so with these kids, when I sit down with them and I try to get them to say, I'm like, say this sound, tell me s, tell me b, tell me k. When I'm actually having them work on sounds, they can say all of the sounds correctly. The problem is that once they put it all in connected speech, it kind of just mushes together. So for those kids, instead of hitting the K sound over and over and over again, or working only on sounds at the ends of words, we're going to work on all sounds, but we're going to work on the clarity. We're going to work on over-articulating and making those sounds more clear. Okay? So you can see there's 4 different pathways for working on speech sounds. Is there one that's better than the other? No. But there might be one that works better for a particular child. And here's the secret, guys, for all of you who are either new to our field or your parents or your teachers and you don't have a background in this. A lot of this is guesswork, and that's okay. You don't have to get it right the first time, but you do have to be paying attention so that you can tell if it's working or not. Okay, and we do that through data collection. So if you say, I think articulation pathway is the way to go for this kid, you start working on this and you're noticing that they're just really not making much progress in being easier to understand, then you might go, let's try a different pathway and see if we make faster progress on that. And that is how we get effective therapy. It's not because we just magically know the right pathway and we always nail it the first time. It's that we're paying attention and we're willing to shift and change and pivot if what we're doing isn't working. Okay? So those are my 4 pathways for speech sounds, but let's look at some of the other areas. I want to try to get through as many as we can today on the podcast. I guess I should say this. The next step after that then, right? If you choose a pathway, is that my pathways are going to break down which skills that you should teach in order to support that pathway. Okay, so the articulation pathway, it's going to tell you specific sounds to teach. The phonology, specific phonological processes. Okay, so the pathway is the overall plan, and then the individual skills are inside the pathways. And those are all, you can access all of that over at the hub at hub.speechandlanguagekids.com. But I'm hoping this gives you kind of this overarching umbrella where you understand these different ways that we can approach this. Okay? All right, so let's look at language, because this is the biggest one. This is the one that we come across the most. And so with language, we're talking about a lot of different skills. And so I'm going to read through the different pathways, and then we'll kind of talk about which one to choose. So one pathway would be the following directions pathway. This would be for our students and our kids who have trouble following one-step or multi-step directions. Maybe they're easily distracted when given instructions or have trouble processing that information. Okay, so that's one. We have an asking and answering questions pathway. So if they have trouble answering WH questions or asking questions in a way that makes sense, or asking and answering questions in class, then they might benefit from the asking and answering questions pathway. We also have a sequencing and retelling pathway. So this is the one where I have so many of the kids need this one. This is probably the biggest one that we get. I have the teachers and the parents telling me, well, they can't tell me about their day. I ask what they did, and maybe they start in the middle, or they're telling me things that don't make sense, or it's all out of order. And so this is the pathway for helping a child learn how to sequence a set of events and retell it. Then we have our grammar and sentence complexity pathway. So this is kids who have lots of grammatical errors. Their speech might sound choppy or incomplete. Their sentences may be shorter or simpler than other kids their age. And this pathway is going to explicitly teach those grammatical structures that they need to make their sentences more complex and more complete. And then I have a Foundations for Literacy pathway. So I'm a big believer, if we are working as a team, then the speech language pathologist is not necessarily the one that should be doing all of the literacy education, because there should be a literacy specialist on the team too, whether that's the classroom teacher or a special education teacher. But I want to make sure that they have all of the phonological pieces, all of the oral language pieces, everything that underlies the literacy piece, so that they are able to make the most out of their literacy instruction that they're getting from someone else. So my Foundations for Literacy pathway is going to include phonological awareness skill, understanding different discourse structures like narratives and opinion pieces and informational pieces, main idea and detail, all of that stuff, and then reading fluency and comprehension and supporting with those skills as well. So that's the literacy pathway that I have. Then I have one for abstract language. I told you there's a lot. Abstract language pathway is for kids who have difficulty understanding figurative language like idioms or metaphors and sarcasm, or who struggle with making inferences. And then I have one for vocabulary. So I have a vocabulary pathway for kids who are struggling with understanding words, learning new words, understanding concepts, all of that stuff. Okay? So those are all the different pathways for language. And what I see happen is sometimes we do our assessment, we do our evaluation, and we say, oh my gosh, look at all they're missing stuff in all these areas. All of these language areas are struggling. And so we write a goal on our IEP, and we say, by the end of the IEP cycle, child will improve language skills by completing all the following benchmarks. And we say they're going to follow directions, ask and answer questions, sequence and retell a story, use grammatical markers. And so we put all these into one goal. Any of you done that? You can raise your hand, or you don't have to tell me. But it's not reasonable, because our kids need direct instruction and they need repetition in order to be able to make progress on those skills. And if we're trying to hit all of those in 1 year, it's too much. Yes, I've seen that in IEPs. Yeah, Celeste, me too. I've written some of those back when I was new and I didn't know any better. So instead, we look at, okay, which of these areas, which of these pathways would make the most impact for this child right now? What's going to help the most? And we set the goal for that. Okay, we acknowledge they have all these language problems, but we also acknowledge that everyone here is only human and we can only hit so many at once. So we're going to pick the skill, pick the area that's going to make the most impact for them, and we're going to hit that. And you know what? If you meet all your IEP goals before the end of the IEP, hooray, you get to have an IEP meeting early to set new goals. And that's a really fun meeting to have with parents, because you say, look how awesome your kid is, as opposed to having to get to the end of the IEP and go, well, we got 3 out of the 7 benchmarks. Like, that doesn't feel as good, right? And I'm not saying that we should lower the standards for our kids. I'm saying that this is a more realistic way to look at teaching communication, because guess what? Just because you're only targeting this one in therapy doesn't mean that they're not going to make progress in all of those other areas. But by focusing in our energies on this one specific area at a time, we give them a better chance of enhancing their language skills, of reorganizing the language parts of their brain so that all of these things are going to make more sense, and they're going to feel confident, and they're going to be more willing to work with you on the things in the future. It all flows when we follow this kind of a structure, okay? So for your language goals, you're going to pick one or maybe two of these to work on, where you're going to say, okay, this year we're really going to hit following directions and asking and answering questions. And then once those are established, then we're going to have a better chance of working on those retelling skills, right? Because we've got this foundation, all right? So think about what those skills are that are going to make the most impact for that child, and those are the ones you're going to follow. Now, if you need IEP goal wording, we have sample goals inside the hub, and we've got the actual materials to teach those skills. We break down all those skills into step-by-step plans, but I want you to see this big picture. I want you to see how we can start with, okay, what area are they struggling with? And then we can go to what's a smaller subset of that area that we can explicitly teach and practice and help them grow in throughout the rest of their day. All right? So I know I'm running out of time because I try to keep these to 30 minutes. And this is what happens when I go off script. But I want to read through the rest of the pathways just so that you have an idea. So bear with me here. We're going to get through the rest. Social communication. We have a social awareness and interaction pathway. So that is responding to others, responding to your name, understanding the perspective of others, and engaging appropriately in social interactions. So this is just our beginning skills. This is a pathway that spans the years. And you'll see in my pathways, I break them down into beginner level, intermediate level, and advanced level. And so a child who's on this pathway, maybe right now they're just going to work on beginning level of responding to others and joint attention. And then maybe we're going to come back to this pathway in another year and work on perspective taking later, right? But the pathway includes a lot of different skills in that social awareness piece, okay? Then we have one for emotional regulation and self-advocacy. So again, this could span years. We start off with our little bitties who just are having trouble communicating what they want and need, and they're getting frustrated and having behaviors. We start with them and self-calming tools. And then as they get older on this pathway, we want to teach them how to say, hey, I need a break. I'm overwhelmed, or I need help. I don't understand what to do. Okay, so that all built into the same arc. Then we have a conversation skills pathway. So this is, how do you initiate an interaction? How do you keep the interaction going once you've started the conversation? How do you handle when somebody disagrees with you in a conversation? How do we work that out with words instead of getting mad, right? So that's all conversational skills. And then again, we hit that abstract language pathway because that was in the regular language section, but it's also a big part of social communication. So there's a pathway for that. And then I put a separate pathway for selective mutism, and that is when they can speak in one setting, but they refuse to in another. And that is an anxiety-based social communication challenge. And so that is, I put it under social, but it really is its own beast because it's such a different way to treat selective mutism than any of our other social communication challenges. So if you have a child with selective mutism or other forms of social anxiety, that one's really good for that. Okay, so those are our social communication pathways. Then we have fluency, which is our stuttering and our cluttering. So we have a stuttering pathway, we have a cluttering pathway, and then I have one I call foundations for fluency pathway. And that includes coordinating your breath with speech and your breathing, and emotional regulation, and being able to address any negative emotions or reactions that are caused by the stuttering, because that is a whole other piece that if we don't really address that can cause so much more trouble with stuttering than anything else. So that's a huge piece to hit. And then I have a different path for word finding and word retrieval, because that, I feel like that is, again, a different approach. It's not really a stuttering thing, but it is a type of fluency challenge. You could also put that in language, because that could be a vocab thing. But a lot of times these kids know the right word. They just can't access it in the moment. Their brain cycles through the wrong words or just doesn't get there. And so that's in the fluency one. Okay. Then we've got functional communication. So remember, functional communication are our kids that are just learning to talk. They're just learning to communicate with us in some way. And we want to help guide them to being able to communicate more effectively. So the first one I have is an early interactions pathway. And this is responding to their name, following simple directions, participating in early social routines. So that's where we start. Then I have the analytic language processor pathway and the Gestalt language processor pathway. So I broke it out into those two. The analytic language processors are kids who are learning language one word at a time. So they say up, they say mama. Okay, those kids are what we call ALPs, analytic language processors. And we have different strategies we use for them than our kids who are using echolalia. And echolalia is repeating what other people said. So instead of using one word at a time, they're using whole sentences, whole phrases, maybe whole scripts that they heard on a TV show. They're mirroring back what they've heard in these large chunks of language. So those are our Gestalt language processors, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we need to support them differently. We need different strategies. So our GLPs have a different pathway. And then we have a fourth pathway for functional communication, that is our AAC pathway. So this is our augmentative and alternative communication. This is for children who their spoken speech is not reliable enough to get their communication needs met. And so they need to use a different way. Maybe it's a picture board. Maybe it's a speech generating device or app. Maybe it's gestures. Maybe it's body language. Maybe it's sign language. There's so many different ways that we can empower kids to communicate with us. And so I have a different pathway for if you have a child who wants to go down that direction and you think that they would be a good fit for using a different means of communication, just until their speech catches up, right? So those are our functional communication pathways. And then the last set I have are the voice and resonance. So these are kids whose vocal quality struggles. So we have a voice pathway for the vocal quality, or a resonance problem where they're hypernasal, or there's air blowing out of their nose while they're speaking, or maybe they're hyponasal. So the resonance piece, that's a different pathway. And then I have one called the Foundations of Healthy Voice Use, which includes vocal hygiene, like not yelling or excessively clearing the throat. We're going to work on reducing strain and developing better breath support for voice production. So that's in the Foundations of Healthy Voice Use. And then the last one we have is a prosody pathway, and this is where we're working on pitch, volume, and rate. So those all go into one. Okay? It's a lot, I know. But when you look at these different pathways, and of course you can go over to the hub and read through these again and look at this specific wordage, verbiage, and see which ones seem to fit. And we have our progress monitoring checklist that you can use where you can actually go through and check boxes, and you will see which boxes, which areas you're checking more boxes in. And that's a really good indicator for which ones you should start with. So you can go through those screening checklists. Those are inside the hub in the free membership. But then once you get to the therapy pathways to actually dig into those, that's part of the paid membership, but it's only $25 a month. And that'll get you access to all the therapy pathways and the step-by-step therapy plans that break down the skills and give you the workbooks for how to work with them. Okay, so all of that's inside the hub. But I hope you can see that when you take this nebulous feeling that we get at the beginning where we say, there's something not quite right. This child is not communicating quite how I feel like they should. There's something off. Then we can go through these areas and we can say, okay, is it speech sounds? Is it language? Is it their voice? What is it that's cueing me into that there's a problem? And then we can dig down into what are the specific areas they need to work on. And then you've got a nice, neat plan laid out for you. Okay? All right. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up because I did hit right at 30 minutes, but hopefully that helps you guys. If you have any questions, hop into the hub. We have a free discussion board so you can come in there and ask questions, get some guidance on what the different pathways are all about and what they support and which skills are included, and we'll answer all of those questions inside the hub. And I would love to hear how things are going for you. So if you have used one of our pathways or you've started down it, go ahead and pop into the discussion board and tell us how it's going and what you like and what you don't like. And that will help us continue to refine this framework and make this the most efficient way to support communication needs in children. All right. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I will see you next week and have a great day. Bye.